Brian's Winter, Chapter 10. A great weight, something heavy on him. His mother was calling for him to come back. He was little again, a small boy playing outside, and his mother was calling for him to come inside, but he couldn't move because there was a huge weight on him, holding him down, keeping him from coming home. Brian opened his eyes slowly, closed them against the brightness and the pain in his forehead, then opened them again. It was, he thought, the same world. Snow all around, bright sun. He was breathing, had a pounding pain in his forehead. It reminded him of the plane crash and had what appeared to be an entire cow moose in his lap. He twitched when he looked down at her. Her eyes still looked mad and her head plowed against his chest, but he realized she was dead. He started to examine his own situation. Nothing seemed to be broken. He could not at first believe this and moved his arms and legs several times to make certain, and then squirmed his way out from beneath the moose. She was lying half on him, her head on his chest, pushing him back. And when he stood, it was the first time he got a long look at how big she was. From nose to back end, he guessed a good 8 or 9 feet, maybe more. He paced her off and came up with 4 paces in length, counting her legs, which were sticking out a bit. Maybe 10 feet. And she was taller at the shoulder than he stood. He wondered for a moment if she was the same moose that had attacked him earlier in the summer and tried to feel that she was, tried to feel some animosity toward her. But the truth was that killing her made him sad. Elated and sad all at once, as he had been with the wolf-killed doe. She was ugly and beautiful at the same time, lying there in the snow, blood from her chest wound smeared where she lay. An ugly, beautiful animal, and she was ended now. He had killed her, ended her life, so that he could live. And he felt as bad as he felt good. He turned away for a moment, shook his head, and then turned back. There was much work to do, and for a moment he thought it would be impossible. It was perhaps half a mile back to camp, and there was absolutely no way he would be able to drag her. He tried lifting a back leg, and it was all he could do to get it off the ground. Dragging her would be simply impossible. She must weigh 600 or 700 pounds. He would have to cut her up here and take her back to camp in pieces. And that nearly stopped him. How, he thought, do you cut up a moose? Never in his whole life had he ever thought about cutting a moose to pieces. Where did he start? There was no dotted lines the way they were in the diagram in the meat market. He thought on this a full 5 minutes, looking at her lying there, and finally realized he could do nothing until she was skinned. He used the knife to slit the hide from neck to down the chest and belly to back end. He had to cut around the lance, which had broken off after driving into her, and the arrow shafts still sticking out because they wouldn't pull free. The skin came away harder than with the doe and was thicker and had to be cut loose as he skinned, peeling it back an ½ inch at a time all along her body. When he cut along the belly, the knife slipped and cut the membrane holding the stomach in, and her guts fell out on his feet, steaming. And he went ahead and pulled the rest of them out that way, amazed at how much there was inside her. The liver alone weighed more than 2 rabbits, and he set it aside to cook later. With the guts out of her, she seemed easier to move, still very hard, but some easier. And he quickly developed a rhythm for skinning. Pull on the hide, slide the knife along. Pull, slide. In half an hour, he had lifted the hide completely off her right side, cutting it around the neck just under her head, and folded it over her back, completely exposing her right side. He had never, even in a butcher shop, seen so much meat in one place. She was a house of meat. Again, he lifted the back leg and couldn't move her, even with the guts out. But as he lifted the leg, he noted that there seemed to be a seam where the leg joined the body, a junction. And he put the knife there and cut the leg and lifted it away from the body. He kept lifting and cutting all around the top of the back leg, pushing up as he did so until it was joined only by the hip socket, which rotated freely. And he cut around the socket with the knife and it popped loose. The leg lifted completely away. Just that, her back leg was heavier than the dough. And he realized it would be hard to get the leg back to the shelter. This would be a long job. He decided to pull the leg back, and when he returned to finish up, an all-night job, and it would be cold. He took off with the leg and used nearly 20 minutes just to pull it to the shelter and was almost exhausted when he got there. He stored it along the wall and went back to where the body of the cow lay. It was now midday, and he was starving. He took 15 minutes to gather wood and start a fire near the carcass, and when it was blazing well, he cut a strip of meat from the rump near where he had lifted the leg off and hung it over a stick so that it nearly touched the flame. He went back to cutting and skinning while it cooked. He cut away the right front shoulder. It lifted off much the same as the rear leg, the shoulder blade cutting away, and then the leg, and he dragged it back to camp. And when he returned, the meat on the stick was perfect, burned a little on the outside, and cooked clear through. He cut pieces off and ate, standing there, looking down at the rest of the cow, and he thought he'd never tasted meat so good. It was better than deer or rabbit or full birds, better than beef. And there was fat on it, more fat than the dough had, and he craved fat. Ate one piece of fat alone that was hanging on the side of the meat that had cooked separately, and still craved it. He cut 2 large pieces of fat off the carcass and hung them over the fire to cook while he went back to work. With the right legs gone, she was lighter, and by lifting the legs on the ground, he found he could just roll her over to get to the uncompleted side. Once she was over, he skinned the side as he had done the first one, working up the back after cutting around the legs until the hide was completely free of the carcass. Then he cut the legs loose, dragged them one at a time to camp, and returned to the body of the moose in darkness. Finding his way there was no problem because there was a half moon and it lighted the snow into something close to daylight. But the cold came now and he had no gloves. His hands chilled as he worked on the damp meat, and he had to warm them over the fire often, which slowed him. And by midnight, everything in him screamed to stop. But the cow was a treasure house of food and hide, and he wasn't about to leave it here for the wolves, or the bear if it came along again. So he kept working. With the legs and rump gone, the remaining part of the carcass was not too hard to handle. He used the hatchet to chop through the spine in 2 places and separated the back, middle, and front end, and it amazed him how much all animals are alike. She was immense, but the cow was built almost like a rabbit with the same basic layout. The same design, he thought, grinning, and suppose if he were on all fours, he'd look much the same way. He cut her head away with the hatchet and dragged the front section of her body and rib cage and the hump meat on top of her shoulders with it back to camp, and then the rear end and the center at the same time. That left only the hide and head. The head he could come back for tomorrow, and he set off with the hide at probably 4 in the morning. It was the worst. It was staggeringly heavy. He couldn't lift it, and dragging it back to camp with his bow and arrows on top of it exhausted him. At camp, he looked at the pile of meat and hide next to his shelter wall, smiled once, shucked out of his rabbit skin shirt, crawled into his bag, and was in a deep, dreamless sleep in seconds. A good, no, he thought, his brain closing down, a great day, a meat day, a moose day. He would sketch it on the shelter wall tomorrow.